In John chapter 4, there is the story of a woman. From the perspective of the world, her life appeared like a complete failure. She had married and divorced 5 times, and the man she was living with now was her 6th. A life of many marriages and divorces, from the world's standards, is a life marked by failure and deep wounds. One day, this woman encountered Jesus at a well. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The woman replied, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" This conversation began with a simple request for water and gradually moved into deeper topics, first about where to worship, then finally about the coming of the Messiah. To the woman who had been waiting for the Messiah, Jesus said, "I who speak to you am he, the one you have been waiting for." In the end, the Samaritan woman believed in Jesus, and her heart was healed, leading her to a transformed life. The story of the Samaritan woman is a precious message for many people today who experience failure, discouragement, and despair, reminding us that it is not the end. It also shows that even when we pass through the valleys of life, our lives can be restored and turned around. So let us look together at what happened to the woman at the well, and learn how we too can find hope when we face moments of failure and disappointment. First, the Samaritan woman lived a painful life. Even one marriage brings many responsibilities and complexities, and multiple marriages and divorces leave deep wounds. But why did she have so many marriages? About 2,000 years ago, Jewish society was deeply unfair to women. Women held inferior legal and social status compared to men, and husbands could divorce their wives if they wished, a system that even Jesus criticized. In this unjust structure, the Samaritan woman was divorced 5 times, not simply due to her personal choices but because of the social pain of the era. As a result, people regarded her as someone with problems, and she likely had no one to share life with. Rather than coming to the well at the usual times of early morning or evening, when other women came for water, she came alone at midday. This showed she could not join others and lived in isolation. When Jesus spoke to her, she responded with guarded hostility. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Her words expressed defensive attitudes and deep bitterness, from years of rejection and discrimination. Yet Jesus did not rebuke her. He did not ignore her, but approached with a warm gaze and touched her wounded heart. "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst again." This was not merely about quenching physical thirst. It was a deep declaration of comfort and restoration for her weary soul, a moment when true living water began flowing into her burdened heart. The story of the Samaritan woman is also the story of many people living today. Even now, people lose self-worth under the gaze and judgment of others, and in repeated failures and hurts. Parents grieve when children fail entrance exams. Young people blame themselves for not getting the job they want. People feel lonely or ostracized among peers. Those wounded by divorce suffer deeply, and immigrants or social minorities endure discrimination and prejudice. The Samaritan woman represents all those with complex pains. She was also a Samaritan, a people despised by the Jews. After the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, foreigners settled in that land, and Samaritans became subject to intense ethnic and religious prejudice from the Jews. Even today, people are ignored or excluded because of skin color, background, education, or economic status. She reflects those struggles. We too face similar situations. We ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? Does God really love me? Is my life a failure? But we must remember, discouragement and despair are not the end, but part of the process. Those in the Bible who were used greatly by God also walked through deep valleys of despair. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and imprisoned. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness as a fugitive. David hid in caves while hunted by Saul. Our lives are similar. There are highs and lows, moments of joy and sorrow, success and failure. If you feel like your life is falling apart, and there's nowhere left to go, remember that is not the end. Rather, it may be the beginning of a turnaround. Just as the Samaritan woman met Jesus unexpectedly at the well, we too can meet him in unexpected places. May that encounter happen in your life. Through that meeting, may forgotten worth be restored, broken self-esteem be rebuilt, and faint hopes be rekindled. Next, Jesus sought out the Samaritan woman, who was living in disappointment and discouragement. He did not ignore her wounded, broken life, but came to her personally. On the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem there were generally 2 routes. One was like a highway, wide, easy, and convenient, and most people use this road. The other was like a country road, a longer, less traveled route, and it passed through Samaria. In John 44, it says that Jesus must go through Samaria. This is not merely a geographical detail, but a sign that Jesus intentionally chose to go through Samaria to meet someone. Jesus did not choose the easy, comfortable path that most people took. He chose the longer, more difficult route for only one reason: to meet the Samaritan woman. This was a journey to meet a woman whose life seemed to have lost all hope, a woman living in despair. When do we come to faith in Jesus? Not when life goes well, not when we succeed or make money, but often when we are sick, tired, weary of life, when no one notices us, when we are poor, or when our strength is gone. Why is that? Because only then do we truly reflect on ourselves and begin to think about God. Jesus' journey to the Samaritan woman happened when she was most weary, lonely, and filled with sorrow. When she went to the well at noon, a time when no one else came for water, Jesus spoke to her. "Give me a drink." This request was not simply because Jesus was thirsty. Jesus was a Jewish man, and she was a Samaritan woman, people who normally would not speak to each other under the cultural norms of that time. Furthermore, as the Son of God, he had no reason to ask a foreign woman for water. Yet Jesus knew that she was not only thirsty, physically but spiritually thirsty, and so he approached her in a simple way, so that he could meet her where she was. Jesus initiated the conversation, and through that dialogue, her heart began to open. In our daily lives, we too sometimes speak first, show concern, or reach out. When a weary coworker says, "I'm really tired lately," that one phrase can open a conversation, and in that conversation, a door to share God's truth may open. Just as Jesus said, "Give me a drink," a small word of care or a simple request can be the beginning of touching someone's heart. Likewise, when we ask for help, conversations can begin. Jesus requested water from the Samaritan woman and revealed his humility, drawing near to her heart. Today, even in our weakness, God opens opportunities for relationships and for sharing the gospel with others. For example, when we say in times of struggle, "Please pray for me, could you help me a little?" Those words may become a channel for God's grace to others. God uses even our weaknesses as tools to save others. Most importantly, Jesus knew the woman's entire life. He knew her past and present, and all the pain and shame she carried. He knew she was a Samaritan, a person despised by the Jews. Yet Jesus did not use these facts as reasons to condemn her. Instead, he embraced her and accepted her just as she was. People often judge and condemn others. They expose past failures and mock the faults of others. But Jesus did not do that. He led the conversation into a spiritual realm, spoke about the true essence of worship, and said, "The time is coming when neither on this mountain, nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father, but in spirit and truth." He then revealed, "I am the Messiah." This entire dialogue was Jesus' intentional journey to find her and bring her into the truth, a divine appointment planned by God. The Bible repeatedly shows how God seeks out the discouraged. A clear example is the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. After Jesus died on the cross, his disciples were devastated. They believed Jesus was the Messiah. But when he was crucified, everything seemed finished. In that despair, two disciples were leaving Jerusalem, heading to Emmaus. Their faces were downcast, their hearts heavy, and their conversation was without hope. Though they had heard rumors that Jesus had risen, they did not believe. At that moment, Jesus began walking with them quietly. They did not recognize him at first, but he explained the scriptures to them. At the meal, when he broke the bread, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Only then did they understand that even the time they thought was despair was actually a time of God's grace. Their heavy steps were transformed into joyful and hopeful ones. Beloved, we too experience failure, discouragement, and moments when we feel there is no hope. But always remember, that very moment can be the time when the Lord comes to find us. There is a Korean proverb that says, "Even if the sky falls, there is a hole through which you can escape." No matter how hard life becomes or how much it seems to collapse, do not forget that at the end of that path, a door of restoration will open. God sent his only Son, Jesus, because your soul is far more precious than the world. So even if you are in discouragement or despair today, may your eyes of faith be lifted to heaven, just as the Samaritan woman received new hope and dreams through meeting Jesus. May an amazing story of restoration take place in your life. Finally, the Samaritan woman was transformed into a new person. Through her encounter with Jesus, she had lived in shame and loneliness, but after meeting Jesus, she became a new person. Her past was filled with shameful and painful memories, but when she met Jesus, her heart was healed and her broken self was restored. She was no longer defined by her past, she became a new creation. Though she had been an outcast because she was a Samaritan, Jesus showed her that this was not a problem at all. The Jews insisted that worship should be in the temple in Jerusalem, and the Samaritans said it should be on Mount Gerizim. But Jesus said that true worship is not about a specific place, but about worshiping God in spirit and truth. This teaching set her heart free from religious limitations and identity oppression she had carried for so long. Most of all, Jesus did not condemn her for living with a man who was not her husband. He embraced her and accepted her as she was. This love transformed the Samaritan woman's view of herself, and she became someone who could see herself through Jesus' eyes. Her transformation led to action. She left her water jar and went into the town to share the good news about Jesus. I have met a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? The woman who once hid from people now boldly testified about Jesus. Her life was not just changed, it became a testimony that drew many to believe and follow him. No longer was she the lonely woman of Samaria. She became a restorer of self-worth, a messenger of the gospel, and a witness of faith. Her life was divided into two eras before she met Jesus and after she met Jesus. Think again. A woman who lived avoiding people, hiding in the shadows of past failures, met Jesus and became a bold proclaimer of the gospel. Her past was no longer a shameful memory but a precious tool of God's grace. A life that once was a road of despair became a channel of the gospel. A life of shame became a life of glory. There are countless people in the Bible and in history whose lives have been transformed by meeting Jesus. For example, Mary Magdalene was a woman tormented by 7 demons, living in spiritual and social suffering. After meeting Jesus, she was freed and became a faithful follower. She stood by Jesus at the cross and was the first to see the risen Lord, becoming one of the earliest witnesses of the resurrection. Another example is John Newton. He was once a slave ship captain, leading a life of debauchery and violence, building wealth on the suffering of others. At the brink of death in a storm, he encountered Jesus personally through God's word. He repented, realized the injustice of the slave trade, and devoted his life to abolition. He also wrote the famous hymn Amazing Grace, turning his painful past into a testimony of God's grace. Beloved, the Samaritan woman was a wounded and rejected person, but through Jesus, she lived a completely new life. Jesus is still seeking people like the Samaritan woman and meets them today. When you meet him, your life will be changed. When you believe in him as your Savior, a completely new beginning opens. May you hold on to that grace and live a renewed life, a life of testimony, a life of hope. I sincerely bless you to live that life today.